I can work with this. So I'm just going to collapse you all down. Nobody wants to look at me, I would have imagined, in my cellar. So I've been asked to really give a talk about air pollution and health and why it matters. And well, I've been working in this area for a very long time. And what I want to do is to maybe just place it in some sort of context with the other risks the population are exposed to, and give you a sense, both globally and locally within London, what sort of impacts it's having on our health and on the future health of our children growing up in our city. Now, I've stolen this infographic. I don't apologize for that. It comes from the World Health Organization. And many of the statistics you will hear bandied about air pollution come from the WHO. And they're related to estimates of the health impacts of the very finest particles within the air. These are often referred to as particulate matter 2.5. It means they're 2.5 microns or an average or smaller in size. And therefore, they're the particles which we can inhale the most actively. And across the world, exposures to PM 2.5 are responsible for 8 million premature deaths per year. 4.2 million of those deaths are because of outdoor air pollution. The remainder are because of indoor air pollution. And the indoor pollution burden is largely felt in the developing world, where people live in poorly ventilated houses burning biomass, for example. Now, this estimate is based on the fact that the WHO have a suggested value, a safe level for PM 2.5 in the air, which is 10 micrograms per meter cubed. The EU has a limit value, which is 2.5 times greater than that, 25 micrograms per meter cubed. And those two numbers really, really matter. To this extent, if you were to look at the United Kingdom relative to the EU limit value for PM 2.5, then practically everybody in the United Kingdom would be in an area which is compliant with that value. If you were to use the WHO value of 10 micrograms per meter cubed, then practically every man, woman and child in this country would live in an area which does not meet that guideline. And you'll be really moving up into the north of Scotland, into the Highlands and the islands before you got to populations which really aren't being exposed to concentrations above that level. And globally, it's estimated that essentially 90% of the world's population live in areas which fail to meet that guideline value. Now, that guideline value hasn't just been plucked out of the air. The reason the two numbers differ is that the WHO guideline value is based on the science. It's based solely on the science and the health impact, whereas the EU limit value is the advice taken by European governments and negotiated to a level which they are comfortable with. They are different things. One is the science, one is using the science as a starting point before economic considerations are brought to bear. And in this slide, it just shows you the sort of distribution of those premature deaths across the globe. And unsurprisingly, most of the burden is in China and India and Pakistan and the tiger economies of the Southeast Pacific. But I think it's pertinent to mention that within the European domain, we're still talking about 500,000 premature deaths each year. Now, what this means, what those numbers mean, is that air pollution is contributing to those deaths. It is not the only thing which is contributing to those deaths, but it's a very important causal factor in early deaths within the population. Now, I said the number's not picked out of the air. I give you another piece of perhaps disquieting information, which is probably 10 micrograms per meter cubed is too high. Now, this is a relatively recent study. It was published in the premier medical journal internationally, which is the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is looking at a population of 61 million people living in the United States. And what they're looking at on the y-axis, where we have this hazard ratio, is the increased chance of dying prematurely within that population relative to the annual concentration of these fine particles, PM 2.5. And you can see this is a straight line going all the way down below 10 towards almost 7.5 micrograms. And there are arguments going on at the moment within the WHO about whether 10 micrograms per meter cubed is actually a valid safe limit anymore. And this is American data, but I could show you data from China, I could show you data from Europe. They basically show the same thing. And of course, the EU limit value isn't even on this graph, you know, it'd be over here somewhere. So this is saying even when you get the concentrations down below the EU limit value, down towards the WHO limit, there is still a health burden within the population. And what does that mean? Well, it means a lot. So this is a map of PM2.5 concentrations in Europe. And what essentially it says, the only regions of Europe which are really below the WHO level are the really northern latitude countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, the very northern regions of Scotland. These are where the concentrations are low. The whole of the whole of England and Wales really are above the limit value. And across the population, this makes a huge difference. This is a distribution of the European population. If you use the EU limit value, you can see there are very few people on this histogram who are above that level. If you use the WHO cutoff, almost 75% of the European population are living in areas where you can say absolutely definitively they are breathing unsafe air. Now, one of the things which has really changed in air pollution research, because the knowledge that air pollution causes people to die sooner than they would otherwise have died is 20, 30, 40 years old. We've known this for a very long time. What has increasingly happened is we've realized that air pollution doesn't just affect the old and the chronically ill. And that was very much the mantra, that air pollution was effectively, the word which was used, it's a very unfortunate word, it's a very cold scientific word, it was caused harvesting, yes? The old and the infirmed, people with pre-existing diseases, were dying sooner because of the impact of air pollution, and it was felt that this impact therefore was an impact on the old. Well, over the last 10 years, we've discovered that is not the case. And we've increasingly become aware that actually air pollution affects you actually when you're relatively well, in your childhood all the way through your middle age, in a way that actually contributes to actually causing the diseases of old age. So if you like, the seeds of your diseases of age are planted in your childhood and in your early middle age. And that is partly impacted by air pollution. In children, there's evidence, I'll show you some, that children in polluted environments have stunted lung development. There's even more recent evidence that they have poorer cognitive development and indeed mental health problems related to the poor air quality in the areas. And there's also increased evidence that people become more susceptible to respiratory infections. And of course, we're all familiar with the fact that within this group, individuals with asthma and COPD will be particularly sensitive. But perhaps what the population haven't realized is that, for example, even with asthma, there is increasingly strong evidence that air pollution isn't simply exacerbating the condition, it's actually playing a role in causing the increased incidence of asthma within our population. And these effects track even further back. Particles from combustion engines have been found in the placenta. There's now evidence that populations, and when people talk about the impact of air pollution on children and during pregnancy, sometimes people think, well, these must be effects which are seen predominantly in the developing world. But a lot of the science showing the links between air pollution and low birth weight or small head circumference in infants actually are studies from London now. The other thing which I would point out here is, when we were thinking over here, maybe historically, about what people were dying of, we were really focusing predominantly on respiratory disease, cancer, heart disease. But again, over the last 5 years, the evidence that air pollution plays a role in increasing the risk of dementia in the old has increased dramatically. And so it seems that air pollution has really a whole range of effects across the whole life course. Now, I wanted to take you to a study which I did quite a while ago now in children, to just highlight some of these early life effects, because in a sense, this is a study in London, and any civilized society should be protecting their children from the adverse effects of air pollution. Now, this is a very long study, and it was designed initially to address the impact the introduction of the low emission zone would have on respiratory health in children in London. And it was based in Tower Hamlets and Hackney between 2008 and 2013. And what we did is we looked at children's lung development and lung function over this period to see whether there would be an association with adverse effects on their lung development, and B, whether the introduction of the low emission zone would produce a beneficial effect. Now, these are sort of, well, on the, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the maps you can see at the moment are annual maps, which represent the concentration of, well, in this case, it's NO2. And I think it's important to mention, I've been talking about PM 2.5. Well, most of PM 2.5 doesn't come from traffic. Most of PM 2.5 comes from a variety of other sources. In fact, there's probably a greater contribution to PM 2.5 from tyre and brake wear than there is from the exhaust. The reason we're interested in the exhaust is there's really good evidence that the exhaust fraction is the particularly harmful part of PM 2.5. If you want to show an effect of tailpipe emissions, you really can't show it by measuring PM 2.5, but you can measure it by measuring NO2, which is co-emitted with the very smallest combustion particles from the exhausts of diesel engines. So in this study, we focused on looking at NO2 particularly, but it's a proxy for everything which comes from the tailpipe of a diesel vehicle. And these are the annual maps of our study area, looking at NO2 concentrations over the study period from 2008 to 2013, and the roads are the greatest. And you can see here, the concentrations are colored. Anything in these maps, which is yellow, is over the EU limit value for NO2, which is 40 micrograms per meter cubed. And this is one of those rare occasions where the EU and the WHO limit value are the same for the annual exposure. And I suppose, just to give you an idea of the extent of the problem we have in London, in 2009, 99% of the children in our cohort lived in an area of illegal air quality under EU law. Which means that, to me, we're not just talking about hotspots. Actually, everybody living in those boroughs, almost 500,000 people, were living in an area which was a hotspot for air pollution. You know, this is a really big, serious public health issue. Now, question one was, did the low emission zone work? And the graphs I'm going to show you are quite complicated because actually it's quite difficult to tell whether these schemes really do work. And the low emission zone really only targeted a relatively small proportion of the fleet, and the effects were really subtle. But we did do some work. And if you look here, what we could show, where it says roadside on the top right-hand side, this is looking at the change over the study period at some roadside sites in London. And we found evidence there was a significant decrease in NO2. It fell by about 1.3, 1.4 micrograms per meter cubed per year, which sounds promising, apart from the fact that if you look at these maps over here, you can actually see that the average concentration was, often around 60, and it would take a long time to meet compliance with that level. Despite that, you can see between 2009 and 2013, well, only 34% of the population lived in areas in 2013 which were non-compliant with the EU value. But that effect had more to do with that year being wet than it had to do with the success of this particular transport scheme. What was the impact? Again, look, this is a very complicated graph in the first instance, so let's simplify it. Let's just focus on the graph which is on the right-hand side, where if you read the y-axis, it's saying we're looking at the change, that's the delta, in FVC, which is the measurement of lung volume, in around 3,000 children per unit concentration of NO2. And so what we're looking at is, does the exposure cause a reduction in lung volume? And then if we look along the horizontal axis, it's saying in relation to their short-term exposures to this particular pollutant gas on the morning they walked to school, the 24 hours before they turned up at school, or the 7 days, or based on their annual exposure. And for each of these increments, we have 2 dots. The black dot is their exposure estimated at their home, and the white dot is their exposure estimated for the amount of time they spent at home. and at school. And in fact, they're the same because these are primary school age children, and, you know, primary schools are very close to the residences. Now, if we look at the annual values, we can see there are 2 stars above them, and those 2 stars tells us something significant is happening. And if we can draw a line across here, what it's telling us is the children in our study are losing an amount of lung volume per each concentration increment of NO2. It's around 2.25 per microgram. Well, if we look at 40 as being the average, that takes us up to about 80 to 90 mils of lost volume, which doesn't sound a lot in a child which has a lung volume of about 1.8 litres at this point. But to put it into some context, it's saying children growing up in these 2 boroughs over the duration of this study, exposed to the average level of concentration, were losing a volume of lung function, which was the equivalent to 2 large eggs. And that is really very, very worrying indeed. And that was happening in recent history, not in the past, right now, to our children living in London. So this is very negative. The air in London is causing adverse birth effects. The air in London is causing dementia. The air in London is killing people prematurely, and the air in London is harming the lungs of our children. But there is hope. We're not the first people to do a study like this. Again, we're back to another study published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And here, again, it's a complicated graph, but at the top, you can see it's saying cohort C, D, and E. And these are studies done in California in the Children's Health Study. And they actually did something very similar to what we did in London. They measured lung function and lung growth in children in different cohorts across different eras of time. So the first time they did it was in 1994 to 1998. Then they did a separate cohort in 1997 to 2001, and then a later cohort in 2007 to 2011. California's air pollution improved dramatically over this period because the federal government in California put in place really very, very tough regulation and penalties to force pollution down. So by 2007, 2011, air pollution had fallen dramatically. Now, what the graph is showing is the proportion of children in their study who had small lungs. And really the important one here is the very final 3 bars in that chart where it says children who have less than 80% of predicted lung function. At this point, this is a clinically significant deficit. So this will be associated with symptoms. And if you can see, the proportion of children with clinically small lungs falls between cohort C, D, and E. So as air pollution improves in California, the number of children with small lungs falls, which means if you can reduce air pollution, you can actually improve lung development in the children in your communities, which conversely means if you do nothing, you are accepting that you are causing harm to the next generation. And actually having small lung volumes by the time you reach adulthood is a very strong predictor of both your life expectancy and your susceptibility to cardiovascular disease. So these things really matter. Now, here's the salient point. This is the exposure range of children in London during our study. The little red asterisk here represents the average concentration. So on average, our cohort were breathing around 45 micrograms per meter cubed of NO2, and most of them were living in areas which didn't meet the legal limits. So that's the London range for NO2, and that reflects our large proportion of diesel vehicles. And these are the concentrations in California between 94 to 97, all the way through to the later years, 2007, 2010. And it tells you that the air pollution in London now is much worse than it was in California in the mid-90s. So the benefits which were seen in California, well, we're nowhere near reducing our air pollution to a level where we would imagine that we would see those sort of benefits. We have a long way to go, but alternatively, another way of looking at it is we've got a lot to achieve by driving down NO2, and with NO2, that fraction of the fine particles that actually comes from the engines of our diesel vehicles. Now, we can move on to the ULEZ. And I'm just going to mention this really briefly. So the low emission zone began to have a protective effect, but it was small. And it was quite clear, because we had established that air pollution was very harmful to the lungs, that it had to be tightened. And the ULEZ is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to actually really drill down and focus on more of the fleet to ensure that we get cleaner vehicles within London. And we've initiated studies now in London to actually do something very similar to what we were doing in the original Exhale study. The study is called Children's Health in London and Luton. We're looking at children's lung development within the current ULEZ zone, and we're using Luton as a sort of comparator site outside London because they don't seem to be doing very much to tackle their air pollution at all. And we're following lung function now in children in what is a 6-year study. But the positive news, I think, from certainly the first 2 years of the ULEZ is that it was working, and it was working remarkably. Now, you can talk about the figures and how accurate they are and how they've been calculated. I think it's safest to say there's been about a 20% reduction at roadside sites for NO2 over that period. You won't expect to see a big change in PM 2.5, but the NO2 signal is telling you something about diesel emissions, and that is very, very positive. We still need, of course, to demonstrate that that change is sufficient to deliver improvements to children's health, but that's what this study is attempting to do. The signs look good. They've been a little bit complicated by the lockdown due to COVID, and I can talk about that later on if you really, really want me to. But nevertheless, the ULEZ is beginning to have changes, and obviously I'm an advocate for its expansion beyond its current area outwards so that the benefits in inner London can be felt by a greater proportion of people.